Today you're going to hear about a serial killer that did not discriminate with his victims. He was willing to take the life of anyone at any time. Like many serial killers in history, we don't have an exact tally of murders, but it's between 18 to 35, maybe even more. Today we're talking about Paul John Knowles, PJK, the Casanova Killer. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you joining today. And you heard just a minute ago the brief synopsis of what you're going to be hearing about today, but here's what you won't be hearing: an overtelling of the gory details. I try to stay away from that anyway, but I feel like in this case particularly, I could have gone that way because there's a lot to tell as it relates to that. But the story of the Casanova Killer is so much more interesting to learn about than the gory details. That information is out there if you'd like to search it up for yourself. But the interesting part is what I think I've accomplished in 10 minutes for this episode. And this guy for sure is going to hell on a full scholarship. It's completely disturbing, and it's disturbing enough without telling you all the minute details of what he did to each victim. And there are a whole bunch of victims. Okay, before we get going with your story today, this is a reminder to subscribe. If you are a brand new listener to the show, if you have been listening for a while but have been searching it up every single time, make sure you subscribe to 10-Minute Murder so that you'll always be able to find the show and never miss an episode. You can also connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. If you have friends that like true crime stories like this one, please let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Links are in the show notes of this episode, as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now, to the story. John Paul Knowles was born the youngest of 5 children on April 25, 1946, in Orlando, Florida. He was born into a family with very few financial resources, which could only afford them to live in a very humble Jacksonville, Florida neighborhood. His father, a World War II veteran, worked in construction. Young PJ began to attract attention by doing petty crimes. His first crime was the theft of a bicycle when he was barely 8 years old, and from there, his behavior went from bad to worse. The authorities intervened and sent him to different reform schools, where he bounced around until he reached the age of 18. Paul needed discipline. He needed love, someone to care about him, and he didn't have any of that. This generated a deep feeling in Paul of distance from his family and a feeling of loneliness. The only thing he really wanted to do at that time was to commit crimes, and over the next 9 years, his criminal career escalated. He moved from small thefts of low value to a major theft of vehicles. He wasn't the perfect criminal, though, and he was eventually caught and sentenced to 5 years after he took the weapon of a police officer. PJ was released early for the good behavior he displayed in prison, despite what he said in his interview, quote, "I'm a criminal, and I've been a criminal since I was a little kid." But when he was released, he restarted his life of crime. And during this period, he met Jackie Knight in a bar, a divorced mother of 2. The two started a relationship to the point that they were even thinking about marriage. In fact, she came to visit him in prison during one of his stints, but once he was released, the relationship was destroyed because of his bad habits, and Jackie Knight chose to leave him. What bad habits? Well, basically every decision that he made was for his own personal gain and/or illegal. During another prison term, he corresponded with Angela Kovich, whom he met with some sort of advertisement he put out there. This, BT dubs, is something that I'm never going to understand. The people that seek out and get into relationships with prisoners that they've never met or have had any kind of relationship with outside of prison walls. You know, Chris Watts, the guy that killed his family in Colorado, women send him pictures and just regular mail daily. I understand that people get lonely, but I don't get why you'd want to connect with a killer like that. Anyway, PJ and Angela decided to be an exclusive couple. With him in prison, I suppose that's not difficult to stay faithful on his part. But they met for the first time in September of 1973. And at that meeting, Angela claimed to feel a very strong connection and attraction to Paul. So much so that she decided to, or was talked into, not sure which, footing the bill for his legal defense, which included a new attorney. But just a little over 6 months later, Angela changed her mind. Even though, with the help of the legal team that she paid for, had earned him his release, she had a strong feeling that something just wasn't quite right with Paul. The couple broke up, and Paul was ticked. But why exactly did she break things off? Well, a psychic told her about a dangerous new man in her life. She obviously thought that that new man the psychic was referring to was Paul. After that breakup, his crimes escalated to violence. It's alleged that on the day of their breakup, PJ killed 3 random people on the streets of San Francisco. His killing rampage lasted almost 4 months and resulted in about 35 violent deaths, maybe, because the police managed to get evidence only enough for 18 of those cases. His violent spree included an attempted murder on the first day of Paul's arrival back in Jacksonville, where he stabbed a waiter. He didn't stay in jail long, and not because he sweet-talked another lady into helping him out, but because he managed to escape on July 26, 1974. After that, he killed at the rate of 1 victim every week. Alice Curtis, 65 years old, was killed by suffocating to death after breaking into her house. As soon as she was killed, Paul ransacked the house, taking anything of value, and took her car. After driving that car for a short time, he needed to get rid of it. He found himself on a quiet neighborhood street where he met 2 girls, Lillian and Mylette Anderson, aged 11 and 7. He abducted them, strangled them, and dumped their bodies in a nearby swamp. The next day, Paul killed Marjorie Howe, a 49-year-old woman who he had seduced and then strangled with her own stockings. Teenager Imogen San Andreas suffered the same fate while she was out for a hike. But one of his most merciless acts of rage and murder happened in Georgia. A father and his daughter met Knowles on November 6, 1974, and kindly invited him into their house. Paul stabbed the father to death and then strangled the 15-year-old daughter, after which he sexually assaulted her body. The features of Paul's victims were very different, and for this reason, the authorities were confused during the investigation. Paul killed girls, boys, men, and women of all ages. He raped them, dead or alive. Sometimes he shot them, sometimes he robbed them. All of it with rage and hatred. There were cases of confusion among the investigators, especially when the crimes were committed in different states, which included California, Nevada, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Connecticut. One of the lucky ones to meet Paul and come out alive was British journalist Sandy Fox. She met him at a bar at a hotel in Atlanta. Sandy was attracted by the killer's personality, like a magnet, and she also said that she was impressed by his, quote, gaunt good looks. The couple attempted to have sex the night they met, but Paul was unable to perform. They tried again the next night and the next night, but he had the same problem. Assuming the reason is that what truly aroused Paul was having an unwilling partner, he preferred to take what he wanted by force. During their couple of days together, the journalist did not gain any real insight into the inner workings of PJK's mind. But maybe the reason he didn't kill Sandy is because he needed her for something. Like nearly every other serial killer, almost a clairvoyant, he knew his time as a free man was coming to a close very soon, and his ego needed to be fed. He wanted her to write a story about him, a true life story. That's what he told her, and then they parted ways. It wasn't long before Paul found another potential victim, and it happened to be a friend of Sandy's. He tried to rape her at gunpoint, but she got away and called the police. When the police attempted to arrest him, Paul pulled out a sawed-off shotgun and fled. He got away. He moved on to West Palm Beach, where he broke into a home, taking one of the 2 women inside as hostage. The other woman was bedridden and not easily mobile, so he left her behind. But he did steal her car. About an hour away, he dropped off his prisoner. The next night, an officer spotted the stolen car and pulled PJ over. He was quicker on the draw than the officer and took him as a hostage. Using the lights and siren on the cop car, Paul pulled over another motorist in order to switch cars. He took that man as a hostage as well. But now he knew that law enforcement wouldn't be too far behind, and he had the added burden of 2 hostages. He drove north to Pulaski County, Georgia. There, in the woods, he took both men out of the car, handcuffed them to a tree, and executed them. While he was busy doing that, the police were busy setting up a roadblock, which Paul attempted to bust through. And he did, kind of. But he lost control of the car and hit a tree. The chase didn't end there. It became even more chaotic, involving police dogs and helicopters. In the end, it was an armed civilian, a Vietnam veteran, that stopped Paul John Knowles. When Paul arrived at the police station, he wasn't shy about confessing to what he had been up to. He confessed at that time to 18 murders and gave locations for some of the victims. In the following month, investigators began collecting evidence to prosecute him. In the course of that investigation, they took Paul out to one of the crime scenes so that he could show them where evidence could be found. Paul saw an opportunity to escape and tried to snatch the gun from an officer while still inside the car. The other officer in the car pulled his own weapon and fired 3 times into Paul Knowles, killing him almost instantly. With his death, justice couldn't be fully served for his victims and their families. Paul John Knowles, the Casanova Killer, was buried in Jacksonville, Florida. During the funeral, the priest had no words about the deceased. He didn't even want to pray for him. So there was only silence.